Okay, well, thank you very much. And I'm glad to be here. I'm a little terrified because my computer that I was going to use had an unfortunate aquatic accident, and I'm now using a vintage iPad. So we hope that'll work okay. And if I have trouble moving these slides, maybe someone else can help me with that. But I'm not going to be able to get through all the material I have assembled here today. I urge you to have a look at it later, but I wanted to go through a few key points, and some of them drawn from comparative analysis of the performance of what we have. We have a probability panel in Canada called the Probit panel. It's got almost 100,000 people in it. It was drawn initially using a live caddy, using random digit dialing. As time went on, that became prohibitively costly, and we switched to using a version of IBR, which we called high definition IBR. And I'd like to stress that in Canada, unlike in the United States, where the FCC precludes calling cell phones from automated devices, that restriction doesn't exist in Canada, which gives us, a much better ability. We also, though, use a live interviewer on the onboarding side to verify the identity, which I think is an increasing issue, and one that I'd really like to talk a little bit about. I noticed the new APOR report on probability and non-probability panels really doesn't deal in any depth with what I think is a really important burgeoning issue, which is establishing the authenticity of the respondent, not just in the sense that people might disguise their identity, but they might not be people at all. Yeah, here we go. Someone else did it for me. Great. So I'm going to start. I'm going to go through a few things, and time permitting, I do want to have time for some of the conclusions and issues I want to raise. But we did a major trial comparing live caddy with Probit and a Probit hybrid, which relates to the offliner issue. There were some interesting results. And the idea of the hybrid, obviously, is to deal with the coverage error of people who either cannot or will not do an interview online. So when we recruit, we ask people that question, and I think it does suffer from some of the same issues that were raised by the last presenter, that there is some wariness about the security of online, and therefore some people identify the preference to be dealt with by phone, not because they can't, because that's the preference. And we see some interesting features where we actually get a reduction in error using the hybrid, which a lot of clients are loath to pay for, unfortunately. But it was not due to the traditional idea that older people, less likely to have the internet, would be represented. It was because younger people who don't really like receiving emails were more likely to accept the invitation. And it seems it might be particularly some of the institutionally mistrustful. So I'm going to then look at a brief review of some of the performance of the Probit panel with other methods during our last federal election. And I want to talk a little bit about a caveat about the use of election results, comparing final results to the actual election as a yardstick of panel quality or sample quality. I think that's questionable, and I'll tell you why. And then I want to talk a little bit as well the ability. I noted the reference in the opening remarks about the Nature study, which noted the poor performance of some of the large data assembly methods that weren't used on probability, which made huge errors in the estimates of vaccination, and that I think it was the probability panel did actually quite well. We have been doing similar research in Canada. Actually, we did 43 waves of research using this Probit panel since the beginning of the pandemic back in March 2020. Interestingly, at that point, 2/3 of our respondents said it would be over in 6 months. Bad guess. But I want to then just conclude with a discussion of disinformation and repeated measures testing, and how we might want to rethink conditioning effects, particularly if we want to strive to have a random probability sample, which we do. We're going to take a little water with our wine, and we have to sort of rethink some of the traditional thinking on conditioning effects, because I think some of the emerging evidence, and I'll show you some today, is that they tend to be benign up to a certain point, and that the expectations about what level of sort of re-interviewing is permissible or desirable is kind of rooted in a lot of clients in an anachronistic conception of how these things work. If I could look at the next slide. Okay, next slide. I've told you that. So yeah, this comparison, which was done with 1,000 live computer-assisted telephone interviews using random digit dial, was compared to a 2,000 case Probit and a 300 hybrid. Overall, the demographics came through quite comparable, but some mode effects were evident in comparing phone and online. What we're thinking about now is, because of cost considerations and other facts, all of the people have been recruited using IVR, except for those early in the stages when we were building the panel. We're thinking, and we've been experimenting with using IVR as the hybrid, because it's considerably cheaper, and it also eliminates the problem of mode effects. And mode effects are quite significant. We find that on some questions, and I think it's a social desirability effect, on questions like economic confidence, and we find, fairly jarring differences. Now, we can model those and say, using random controlled experiments, this is the calibration of that effect. But if we were to use the IVR, I think we wouldn't have those mode effects. So just a couple of, next slide, please. So yeah, I mean, I made the key points. We thought the offline population would be older, less comfortable, and we didn't find the positive effects in those groups. What we found them was counterintuitively with the younger respondents, and it did appear, though, that the use of the hybrid produced a statistically significant reduction in sampling error on education, income, and household size. In fact, in a number of those cases was lower than the live caddy. We also find a significant but mode effect with age, with the probe panel underrepresenting younger Canadians, particularly young women. And we did find some differences on things like religion, but we think some of those might have been because the census comparisons we're using were actually dated back 10 years. And so we had fewer people of faith, which I think is consistent with the trend lines on increased secularism in Canada. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll give you the three-way comparison we've done in our most recent election. If we can look at the next slide. These were results using IVR, which we have a special version of that allows us to simulate the concatenation or randomization of the prompts, where we actually create multiple versions and then concatenate them after the fact. We had live interviewers, and we had probe it online. Basically, as you'll see on the next slide, we found that the results were within the margin of error. They were consistent. It did appear that the IVR did a little better job, and I'll explain that later if I have time, in picking up some of those institutionally mistrustful. And that's a key challenge. I know that the APOR report on the last elections suggested that even though polling firms have made adjustments to deal with the deficiency of less under-college educated in the previous election, they still had an average 3% miss. And they feel, and I think they're right, this was due to institutional mistrust. So we're trying to figure out ways to measure institutional mistrust, because unlike demographics, we don't have population estimates. It does appear it's strongly related to some of the measures on vaccines that we were tracking, and we think it could have provided a temporary proxy for institutional mistrust. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip through this because I want to get to some of the stuff on the results with the study of the pandemic and vaccine behavior and so forth. So if I go to the next slide. Yeah, just it was interesting that one of the reasons I think that using the correspondence between final poll and election outcome as a sketchy measure of quality is, in the case of the last election, this was confirmed in the exit polling. We actually were within 0.2% of the win, and we were within less than 1% of the other parties. And we were quite a bit off on what was the Conservative Party and the People's Party, which is a further right party in Canada. But when we cumulatively put those two parties together, we were once again within 1 point. And our exit polling showed that in the final weekend, that the People's Party voters, which was the further right party, in fear of electing a Liberal government, moved to the Conservatives or stayed home. And that was the focus of the final campaigning and get out the vote amongst the Conservatives. So we think it did a terrific job of modeling what happened in that election. Next slide, please. Yeah, and that's too busy, but I suggest you have a look at this later, because it actually is interesting. It looks at when people made the original decision, when they moved and why, and from what party to which. Anyway, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about vaccine uptake and the correspondence. And we actually used our results, and it was interesting at the beginning of the pandemic. The government of Canada, who was our main client, was using a variety of different suppliers with panels. None of them were probability panel. As time went on, it became clear that our panel was doing a better job of both predicting who was going to get a vaccine and for what reasons, and also lined up better with the official statistics. So that is, and this was a consistent advantage. So we consider that a significant victory, because it now will spill over to other areas where it is important to have scientific accuracy and real respondents. Next slide, please. So we found that our survey results, we were very close to the actual numbers, particularly on the original early stages of the vaccine rollout, which worked rather well in Canada despite a slow start. We ended up getting about 90% of adults with at least 2 doses. And we found a pretty strong correspondence between what we were finding in our results. If I could show you just the figures on the next slide. You can see this is the tracking with the official numbers compared to what we were finding. You can see it's pretty darn close. And this is broken down recently. And what we found in Canada is that the incidence of people who have stopped at 2 doses, they now look a lot more like the people who received no doses. And they are, the key feature explaining that is disinformation and institutional mistrust. So that's something we're trying to follow. Next slide, please. I'm not going to show you this. This is just, again, it's going to make that point about, next slide, the strong linkages to the kind of strong take up that we had and expressed interest in taking the vaccine, which translated into behavior in the case of the first 2 doses, which had, interestingly, a mandate enforcing it. It really eroded as the combination of disinformation and the disappearance of mandates, and is really actually quite weak right now in Canada, which is, I think, unfortunate. Next slide, please. Yeah, interestingly, and I hope I have time to get a couple of these more points in, the panel actually saw with this repeated measure design, which gave you a combination of longitudinal and cross-sectional capacity, where you could do repeated measures with the same individuals. We saw things earlier that the clinical research was showing, several months after we saw it. For example, we found that incidence of people, and we used clinical tools were asked in other countries, that exhibited long COVID was around 17%, and that's consistent with what we've seen in the UK and the United States. And we also found early that this was much more common amongst women than men, which is something that the clinical evidence is showing later. One thing we found that was really quite striking is, as time goes on, the severity of COVID bout has become less severe. That's because you've got better treatments, more immunity. And so what happens, people go, oh, no problem. And they go on to get COVID again, about 20-25% of the time. What happens now is if you get COVID a second time, that trebles the chance of getting long COVID, which rises from 15 to 45%. And then people go, oh, wait a second, I was disinformed. That's awful. I should have got a bivalent. And so this problem is a very significant public health and economic problem, but it was really signaled early in our research before it showed up in the clinical. Let me move to the next slide.
2 minutes.
Am I run out of time?
You've got about 2 minutes to wrap up.
Oh, good. I can talk even faster. You can see if I could move to the next slide, you can see this vivid illustration that you lose the long COVID lottery if you actually get COVID more than once. And the other interesting feature is you're less likely to talk about it because you're abashed or you feel you've made a mistake or you've been disinformed. So it's relatively occluded, and this is a really major percolating problem. Next slide. I've got a couple of concluding slides. Oh yeah, I'll just show you the disinformation stuff because it's interesting, because you show the next slide. We measure disinformation using a variety of questions which have been asked in other countries, such as the Kaiser Institute in the United States. Next slide. We found that there was pretty similar levels of disinformation going on in the United States and Canada. If I could just go to the next slide. I want to show you the ability to both look at disinformation and find out if there are conditioning effects. We took a large sample of people that had done the disinformation test in January, resurveyed them in July, and we actually compared them a fresh sample of 700 in each case. We found that mobility was largely focused in modest shift. And that's an interesting insight. If you did just the cross-sectional, it would look like nothing had moved. Whereas when you looked at the micro level, at a case level, about half the cases had made some shifts, and the shifts were linked to things like contracting COVID. So it did make sense. One last slide to show that. And I want to show, if I can, one more slide. Yeah, so I just want to show you how important this disinformation thing is. So that's the patterns of movements. I'm going to move to the next slide, because not only does it move, and we're now getting some sense of why it does, but it's incredibly predictive of so many things. You probably, my home city of Ottawa is not typically famous, but we were last year, unfortunately, for an occupation which went on for 3 weeks. Let me just show you the links between disinformation and mistrust and sympathy with the freedom movement and so forth. Next slide. So here we go. How much trust do you have in the federal government in Ottawa? It's not very high overall. It's been declining as it has in other advanced Western countries. But look at this link between disinformation. This is the number of times people get the questions wrong. If you got them all right, which half of Canadians do, you have moderate trust in government. If you got them all wrong, and as you move down, you literally zero trust in government. Next slide, please. And you can see, if we use that freedom movement in Canada as a proxy, we just did a major review of that, a commission, you can see the vivid and monotonic connection between disinformation and sympathy for the freedom movement is equally connected to whether you take a vaccine. It's equally connected to emerging issues such as climate change and so on and so forth. And I probably am out of time. If I have the concluding slide, there's just a couple of points. One point I want to make, final slide. So the panel worked well, that's great. We think hybrid methods continue to produce better results for surprising reasons. Conditioning effects are surprisingly benign. There are limits on institutional trust and vaccine reporting. Next slide, final point. One point I want to leave you with. I looked at the latest CIPHER report on probability and non-probability, and I've listened, and I'm struck by the relatively scant attention to the issue of fraudulent respondents. If we look at the estimates, and I remember I presented a few years ago when Pew came up with something estimating some 7 to 11% of the respondents were fraudulent, very rigorous, I think perhaps a conservative estimate. I've seen other estimates by Donata themselves saying that there was 38% weren't real people or weren't reliable, and others like gray matter go as high as 46. I want to know, what is the real number? Is it going up or down? And I want to throw out this question. If you have click farms with tethered SIM cards that are now infiltrating panels, not just to game it for the modest incentives, but also to sow disinformation, because disinformation is being used as a tool of statecraft, as well as, you know, for other types of things. Can you imagine those tools connected to Chat GTP? I know the 3 and 3.5 version couldn't do a survey properly, but I can imagine this would be a big problem for that AI to create something which would be virtually undetectable. Will that produce a renaissance of things like phone or other methods that will allow you to at least verify? I leave those questions, but I really would like to get some answers. Sorry if I've taken a little long. Thank you very much.